Talked about some of the greatest generals and commanders of World War II because of their battlefield tactics, decision-making, and being an inspiration to their troops.
They made decisions that cost thousands of lives. They ignored reality, clung to outdated tactics, and led their army straight into disaster. Some were arrogant, some were just plain incompetent. But these are the 5 worst generals of World War II. Let's start with Lloyd Fredendall, a general who spent more time fortifying his own bunker than leading his troops. As the U.S. Army's commander in North Africa, his job was to push east and help defeat Germany's Afrika Korps. Instead, he dug himself into an elaborate underground hideout, miles from the front lines. While his men fought in brutal desert conditions, Fredendall enjoyed fresh food, thick concrete walls, and steel doors protecting him from a battle he rarely participated in. But distance wasn't his only problem. His leadership style was a disaster. He ignored the chain of command, bypassing officers and issuing confusing orders directly to lower-ranking troops. Even worse, his commands made no sense. He used random code words and cryptic instructions, expecting everyone to understand. Instead of saying, "Move your unit to this location," he'd say, "Have your boss report to the Frenchman whose name starts with a J at a place that begins with D." Officers were left scrambling, trying to decipher his nonsense while their troops sat vulnerable and directionless. Then came the Battle of Kasserine Pass in 1943, America's first major fight against the Germans. Fredendall's poor leadership left his troops exposed and unprepared. Meanwhile, on the other side, Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's best generals, was ready to strike. He quickly found the weak spots in the American defenses and launched a devastating assault. The result? A complete disaster. Thousands of U.S. soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. American forces were thrown into a chaotic retreat, humiliated in their first real test against the Germans. Fredendall, safe in his bunker, panicked. But instead of taking responsibility, he blamed his officers, his troops, even his allies. It didn't work. General Eisenhower couldn't afford to keep him in charge. He was quietly removed from command and sent back to the U.S. to train new recruits, a much safer role, far away from the battlefield. But when it comes to collapsing under pressure, Arthur Percival takes it to another level. As the British general in charge of defending Malaya and Singapore, nicknamed the Gibraltar of the East, he was supposed to stop the Japanese advance. And on paper, he had everything he needed. His troops outnumbered the enemy 2-1. He had an island fortress with big coastal guns and strong defenses. But in just a few weeks, his forces were completely outmaneuvered, overwhelmed, and forced into one of the most humiliating surrenders in British history. His first mistake? Underestimating the Japanese. He assumed they couldn't handle jungle warfare, had inferior equipment, and wouldn't attack from the north through Malaya's thick forests. He was wrong on all counts. Led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese advanced quickly, using bicycles to move through terrain Percival thought was impassable. Meanwhile, British defenses were spread too thin and completely unprepared for the speed of the attack. At every turn, the Japanese outflanked them, forcing retreat after retreat. Percival made things even worse by refusing to prepare proper defenses. He believed that telling his men to dig in would damage morale, so instead of fortifying key positions, he kept stretching his troops further apart. This left gaping holes in the British lines, which the Japanese exploited with ease. By the time Percival's forces reached Singapore, the island was barely defended, and the city's big coastal guns were pointed out to sea, not at the land invasion actually happening. When the Japanese stormed in from the north, British troops were caught off guard. Supplies were running low, morale was crumbling, and chaos spread through the ranks. After just a few days of fighting, Percival realized he had no options left. On February 15, 1942, he walked under a white flag and surrendered, marking the largest British military surrender in history. Over 130,000 British and Commonwealth troops fell into Japanese hands. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. Percival spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, and in a cruel twist of fate, he was later brought to witness Japan's official surrender in 1945, a grim reminder of his own failure. Some generals were bad on the battlefield, Gregory Kulik was bad before the battles even started. As a close ally of Joseph Stalin, Kulik had enormous influence over the Soviet military. Unfortunately, he used that influence to drag the Red Army backward. He dismissed automatic weapons as unnecessary, thought tanks were overrated, and actively worked against modernizing Soviet artillery. While other nations were racing ahead with new military technology, Kulik was determined to keep the Soviet army stuck in the past. His stubbornness had real, devastating consequences. He rejected submachine guns, arguing that Soviet soldiers wouldn't be able to use them properly. While other armies were shifting toward rapid-fire weapons, he insisted that traditional bolt-action rifles were more than enough. Then came his infamous stance on tanks. Kulik thought armored divisions were a waste of resources and would block the production of the T-34, now recognized as one of the best tanks in the war. Instead, he pushed for the outdated lighter models that were no match for German panzers. By the time Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Soviet tank divisions were severely underprepared, all thanks to Kulik's refusal to accept reality. His failures didn't stop there. As head of Soviet artillery, he was responsible for developing better anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, but he opposed them at every turn. When the Germans invaded, Soviet ground forces were left with outdated equipment that couldn't stop advancing panzer divisions. The Red Army was already struggling, but Kulik's decisions turned a difficult fight into a full-blown disaster. And then came his biggest failure, Leningrad. Tasked with organizing the city's defense, Kulik ignored intelligence reports and dismissed the threat of a German advance until it was too late. His management allowed the Germans to encircle the city, trapping millions inside. The siege of Leningrad became one of the longest and deadliest in history, with civilians facing starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. The suffering was unimaginable, and much of it could have been avoided if Kulik had done his job properly. Even Stalin, who had protected him for years, finally had enough. After the disaster at Leningrad, Kulik was stripped of his command and demoted. He spent the rest of the war desperately trying to shift blame, but his reputation was beyond saving. After the war, his past failures caught up with him. No longer protected by political connections, he was arrested, charged with treason, and executed in 1950. Then there's Mark Clark, a U.S. general who proved that ambition can be just as dangerous as incompetence. Clark was in charge of leading the American advance through Italy in 1943, a campaign already made difficult by rough terrain, terrible weather, and a determined German defense. But instead of focusing on the mission, Clark seemed more concerned with making a name for himself. From the start, his leadership raised concerns. He was politically skilled, which helped him climb the ranks, but his battlefield decisions often put personal glory ahead of strategy. His first major mistake came at Anzio, where the Allies launched an amphibious landing to outflank the Germans and break the stalemate in Italy. The plan could have worked if executed properly, but instead of pressing forward immediately, Clark hesitated. That delay gave the Germans time to recover and relaunch a devastating counterattack, which should have been a quick breakthrough turned into a months-long battle. With Allied troops trapped and under relentless fire, the price for his indecision? Thousands of casualties. But Clark's worst blunder came in 1944. After months of brutal fighting, the Allies finally had a chance to crush the retreating German 10th Army. It was the perfect opportunity to deal with a decisive blow and shorten the war in Italy. Clark was ordered to pursue and destroy the fleeing enemy. Instead, he ignored those orders and marched his army into Rome. Capturing Rome made for a great headline, but it had no real military value at that stage of the war. The Germans had already decided to abandon the city, so when Clark arrived, there was no real fight, just a moment of personal triumph for him. Meanwhile, the German 10th Army, which should have been wiped out, escaped north. They regrouped, dug in, and extended the fighting in Italy for nearly another year. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers died in battles that could have been avoided, just so Clark could have had his victory parade. Even before Rome, Clark's reckless decisions had led to unnecessary deaths. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the most heavily fortified German positions in Italy, he ordered an understrength infantry division to attack head-on across a river against dug-in German defenses. It was a disaster. The division was nearly wiped out, and Clark later faced a congressional inquiry for his poor judgment. Clark also had a reputation for disregarding the well-being of his own men. He frequently underestimated German defenses, ignored intelligence warnings, and pushed his troops into battles they had no chance of winning. His obsession with recognition often clouded his judgment, and the soldiers paid the price. By the time the war ended, the Italian campaign had become one of the bloodiest and least effective of the entire conflict. The Allies eventually won, but at a cost that could have been much lower with better leadership. Clark got his fame, he was promoted and continued his career, but his legacy is forever tied to the unnecessary sacrifices made because of his professional ambition. That's all for the worst generals of World War II, and the disasters they left behind. Some were blinded by arrogance, refusing to adapt. Others made reckless decisions that cost thousands of lives. But no matter their reasons, none of them could escape the consequences of their failures. If you're interested in more fascinating history content, make sure to click on the next video.